Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about youth unemployment, key issues and policy challenges. Before I begin, let me give the normal disclaimer. The opinions and views provided in this presentation are mine and mine alone and do not necessarily represent the views of the World Bank policy, its executive directors, or the countries they represent. All errors and omissions in this presentation are solely my own. I'm going to give a brief outline of my presentation. It's going to be very short. So there are three big parts. The first part deals with why focus on youth unemployment. The second part is actually how to promote youth employment, and I break that up into two parts. First, I talk about labor demand, and second, I'll talk about labor supply. And after that, we will sum up. First part, why do we want to focus on youth unemployment? Now, what you have in front of you are the total unemployment rates by regions. And first thing you can see is that the global unemployment rate is at 6.2%. This is in 2010, according to the ILO, and approximately 205 million unemployed globally in the world. Unemployment rates, as you can see, varies enormously across the regions. We have East Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia, all which are relatively low at around 4 to 5% in 2010. And then we have the moderate countries in terms of unemployment rates. We have developed economies, Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, in about the 7 to 8 range. And then we have those countries with relatively high unemployment rates. We have the Middle East, North Africa, and Central and Southeastern Europe, around 9 to 10%. And these, as you can see, have not changed too much over the past half a decade or so, with the exception of developed economies, which has really gone up quite a bit after the crisis. So one thing that we're looking at today is why are unemployment rates for some regions higher than the others. What you have in front of you is the youth share of total unemployment. And you can see that, again, there's a lot of variation across the regions. You have East Asia, again, which is very low at 18.6%, which means that of the total unemployed in East Asia, 18.6% or 19% of them are youth. At the other range of the spectrum, you have Southeast Asia, which is at 52.8%. And you can again see the Middle East is at 47.2%, which is relatively high. But note that even though Southeast Asia's share of unemployed, the youth share of unemployed is relatively high, the overall unemployment rate is pretty low. So the total number of youths actually being unemployed may not be that high in Southeast Asia. The next chart, we actually look at youth and adult unemployment rates. And what you can see across all the regions is that the youth unemployment rates are much higher than that of adults. And this was clear back in year 2000 as well as in year 2010. For the world, you can see that youth unemployment rate is at 12.6%, whereas the adult unemployment rate is at 4.8%. So it's 2 to 3 times higher. In other countries like the Middle East, other regions and like the Middle East and North Africa, they are even higher, with youth unemployment rates close to 25%, while that of adults is at 6.5 and 6.2 respectively. So what we can take away from the past few slides is that the youth, the unemployment situation facing the youth is really quite different from that of adults. And if we take specific policies to tackle youth unemployment, we may be having effective ways of reducing the overall unemployment rate. There may be other reasons for us to worry about unemployment. Firstly, the youth have a higher likelihood of being underemployed and among the working poor. According to the ILO, the number of youth working poor in 2008 stood at 152 million. That is equivalent to a youth poverty rate of 21.8% in 2008. This is actually the share of working youth in total unemployment, in total youth unemployment. So that's a very large number. Apart from that, the youth face special challenges when they're trying to work in the labor market. First of all, there's a high chance of them losing their jobs during economic downturns. This is what we call the last in, first out phenomenon. And studies have done that compared to adults, youth actually have twice the amount of, twice as much probability in terms of losing their job compared to an adult. There are also specific barriers to entry. This often stems from lack of experience, lack of credit history, and among other things. So because they're just starting out, they're new entrants into the labor market, they face additional barriers compared to persons who have been working for some time. Lastly, there's path dependence. So early unemployment increases the likelihood of subsequent unemployment. And actually, because of this, that where what you've been doing in the past matters a lot, we can actually see there's a large amount of discouragement among young workers. According to some estimates, there are 1.7 million fewer youth in the labor market than expected based on longer-term trends. And most institutions agree that discouragement among the youth in terms of participating in the labor force has risen very sharply in the past few years. Lastly, as we are all very aware of, the youth being very tech savvy and they have a lot of aspirations and high expectations, and if they are unable to find employment that matches their ability and their qualifications, this is likely to result in social and political unrest. And this is obvious from what we've seen in the Arab Spring. I'm going to move over now to talk about youth employment, and I'll first focus on talking about stimulating labor demand. I'll break up labor demand into various segments. First of all, we'll talk about overall labor demand, and then we'll talk about importance of labor market regulations, whether they're rigid or flexible. We also move into various channels of labor demand. We have public sector or government labor demand, private sector labor demand, and entrepreneurship. Now, first thing, public sector labor demand, we can break it down into regular salaried civil servant positions and short-term public works. First, in terms of overall labor demand, what we have in front of you is called the redundancy cost indicator, which is basically an indicator of the firing cost. How much will it take, how much resources a firm would need to fire a worker. This regional chart, you can see that for the OECD countries, for example, theirs is the lowest. So in order to fire a worker, on average, it takes 26.6 weeks of salary to fire someone. At the other range of the spectrum, you have South Asia, which takes about 76 weeks of salary before you can fire someone. While termination due to redundancy is legal in most countries, many of them have very complicated regulations that require notification, justification, approval for dismissals. And firing costs includes notice requirements, severance payments, and penalties. Empirical evidence has shown that if firms or employers have difficulty firing people, they will not hire. So take, for example, you're looking, you have this young person coming to you who wants a job. They have very few references, no work experience, you're not sure about their capability in terms of working as a team and technical knowledge, etc. and would you be committed to hiring them for a long term? So the answer is probably no. So if it's very difficult to get rid of people, employers would be less willing to take a chance to hire people. So the main messages from the empirical evidence that we've seen is that if employers cannot fire people, they will not hire people. In order for them to get them to hire people, they will need to be able to fire people. So this is, I think the literature is what we call constructive destruction. And let's read that. So that was the key message for this slide. Now, turning to government employees. This figure shows the compensation. Well, before that, we know that the public sector is a main employer for many economies that provides workers with secure, lifelong, tenured positions. If the workers are not productive, it often becomes not fiscally sustainable to do this. So let's turn to the chart. Different regions have different shares of how much they spend on the compensation of government employees. The lower end of the spectrum, you have North America, which is only 12% of government expenses falls on compensation of government employees. And then at the other end, you have Middle East and North Africa, which is at 33%. If the government is a major employer, sometimes it may provide a distortionary effect that biases against the private sector. We hear right now in certain countries, for example, in Tunisia, even right now, the youth that are graduating from universities are still hoping to get a position in the civil service because of its stability, because of the wages that they offer. And they rather wait for a government position rather than to go into the private sector. So this in fact actually creates some distortionary effect in terms of getting people out of an unemployment into a proper job. Governments, apart from providing long-term positions, are also able to create public sector schemes that are short-term in nature. The public sector would be able to help youth in the short run by starting high employment intensive investments such as infrastructure or construction, and these will create opportunities in sectors that are dominated by the youth. So those are two ways that I'm focusing on in terms of public sector labor demand. Now, a key engine for sustainable long-term economic growth and job creation will be private sector. Now, in order for the private sector to grow, private sector and overall private sector growth will need good investment climate. So the much about things that we're talking about in terms of good investment climate, good doing business practices, all those would be very relevant for the private sector to grow in countries. So what the investment climate actually surveys show is that firms are very averse to corruption, unfair competition, and macroeconomic uncertainty. These are very, very important critical bottlenecks that firms would try to avoid when they're trying to invest in a country or start a business. There can also, at the national level, there can also be sectoral policies that lean towards more youth-friendly employment sectors. So there are some sectors that, such as tourism, catering, information and communication technology, ICT, health, and the sports sector. These sectors, if they're targeted, what we found is that typically it tends to help the youth a little bit more. And lastly, there's employment-friendly development strategies. And these are what we call long-term growth strategies that need to be considered when we are trying to enhance private sector labor demand. So let's go to one aspect for that. What you have in front of you is the export revenue by type of exports, all as a share of GDP in 2008. So the exports that we're looking at is non-oil goods and services, that's the blue columns, oil and gas, that's the red columns, and remittances, that's in green. But let's focus on the blue and red. So we see that, for example, in East Asia, EAP, we see the blue line to be very high, so they do export a lot of non-oil goods and services. Whereas at the other end, we have the MENA countries, and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the non-GCC oil exporters, all of them, their exports heavily leaning towards oil and gas. So one thing that we want to focus on is global integration and economic diversification. It is very important not to have your exports all in one basket. For example, many of the countries in MENA, their economies are very tied up to the price of oil. So when the price of oil goes down, we see that their GDP goes down, and when the price of oil goes up, their GDPs goes up. And all this volatility is very bad for the employment of youth. As I said before, they're the last in, so they're the first to go out. So once the economy comes down, many youth will be out of jobs, and then things like that. So there's a lot of volatility, and you cannot get long-term employment with that. So one thing to help you would be to create some volatility, and in my opinion, it would be good to diversify away from oil, having a bigger economic base. So and get plugged into world production chains for scale. So you have to produce more things, and then you export them. Very similar to what the East Asia did, but other countries who had to find what they should produce in, and that will help their economies. So that it depends on a very country-specific development strategy that we need to look at. A lot of countries have also been focusing on trying to increase value added in their products. And the World Bank has what we call a knowledge economy framework, which actually, knowledge economy is an economy that uses knowledge as an engine of growth. So basically, by doing that, countries try to focus on knowledge economy in order to enhance the value added of their products, to take advantage of the knowledge that's in the world and try to find a way to propel your economy on a long-term basis, not just for a short run. Okay, the knowledge economy framework basically has four pillars. We have the economic institutional regime, we have education, which is the labor supply, we have innovation, and this takes into account actually the research and development and using knowledge to actually enhance your products. And also you have information infrastructure, which is basically the information technology that's available for dissemination and processing of information. Now, it's important to see that all of these four things are interconnected and interdependent. Education, which is the labor supply, innovation, which is labor demand, these two things need to match. So in terms of a knowledge economy framework, and when you plan for this, you actually have a big blueprint for your economy on how you're supposed to, what sort of labor demand you want to cultivate in terms of high value added sectors, and you need to make sure that your labor supply actually matches that for your overall development strategy. So that's just an overview of a couple of development strategies that countries are looking at today. Now, another important strand of labor demand from the private sector is actually self-employment or entrepreneurship. When people have, when jobs are extremely lacking and they have no choice but they need to make a living, many of them actually turn to starting their own business to earn a living. So this can be from the very small family businesses that bring potatoes to the market, or it could be someone actually putting together capital, labor, and some money and setting up shop and making computer chips or things like that. So, but when you come to think of it, the youth face unique challenges when trying to start a businesses. They lack experience, they lack skills, they don't have a credit history, and they have more difficulty in assessing business networks and sources of information. They don't know that many people. So one way to help youth would be actually to have programs and strategies that address the barriers to doing business for the youth, and these things would be helpful. Evidence has shown that also when you educate the youth in terms of enterprising behavior and boosting the confidence for calculated risk taking, this actually increases the probability or the incidence of entrepreneurship being adopted as a career option. Next, we move on to promoting youth employment, but we look at it from the labor supply side. When we do investment climate surveys all around the world, it's not just for MENA, not just for Africa, many regions of the world, firms actually report that low labor skill is a major constraint to them for business creation. And firms are not merely complaining about deficiencies in relevant experience, technical skills, but a lot of them emphasize the soft skills as well as personality trait, social graces, interpersonal skills, language, and personal habits. So they also complain about this person always arrives late, doesn't know how to work as a team, etc., etc. So all these things are considered low labor skills that firms need, to be enhanced before they can hire them. Now, one problem with that would be technical skills. And next slide you see in front of you is actually the distribution of university students by fields of specializations. It may be a bit small, but basically first of all, let's look at East Asia. You can see they have extremely high share of graduates in scientific, technical, and engineering fields. So research has shown that these are the subjects actually that enhances economic growth, right? When you look at the other countries, such as in other regions, such as in MENA or Latin America, you do not see such a high share of university graduates going into scientific fields and engineering fields. That's just a fact. I mean, but everyone needs to choose what they want to do. But it has shown that in East Asia, they do concentrate quite a bit on these things. As an economy of whole, if you're planning the economy, you do need to make sure that when students go into universities, they are actually churning out the sort of fields that are industry relevant, what is needed for the country. So when you want to promote youth employment through the labor supply channel, it's important to have a well-linked and educational and training system. This requires a very close cooperation between the education system and the private sector, right? The private sector needs to be involved from the beginning in terms of setting up the curriculum, because they need to make sure the curriculum is up to date and industry relevant, something they need to use. Apart from them, going through the school, the students also need a lot of hands-on training. So work-based training, apprenticeship, all these are very important to acquire the correct kind of skills, doing what the industries and the firms really need. And when they do this sort of internships and apprenticeship, they can also be exposed to some of the soft skills that are needed. How to work in a team, how to relate with your managers, with your peers, with your subordinates, all these things, it won't come to a shock for them. So key thing is that when designing educational curriculum, we need to make sure that's industrially relevant, and the private sector is on board from the beginning. I'm going to sum up by telling a story. There once was 3 blind persons, and they had never seen an elephant before. So someone put an elephant in front of them, and the first blind man was feeling the trunk of the elephant. Oh, the elephant is long and he can bend. and the end there's something sucking my hand as well. So elephant must be something like a snake. And the second blind man was feeling the tail of the elephant. Oh, the elephant is very skinny and there's something furry at the end. So it also must be like kind of a snake. The third man was grabbing the elephant's leg. Oh, elephant is huge and round. It feels like a tree trunk. It's very hard, doesn't seem to move. So here's the question. Who was correct? Well, the answer is all of them correct. All of them were feeling the different parts of the elephant. But the moral of the story down here is that we need to, apart from knowing the parts of the elephant, we need to see what the whole elephant looks like as well. So this actually leads to my summing up. Youth employment and employment in general is an extremely complicated problem. We need to worry both about labor demand, both in terms of how much, and we also need to worry about the type. Same thing for labor supply. We need to make sure our people are working, they have the skills, and also need to worry about the type of skills they have. Next, we need to worry about what labor demand has to offer and what labor supply has to offer and match them. Only when these things come together, then you have employment. If either one of them is not working well, you're going to have jobs that may not be filled, or on the other hand, you don't have enough jobs and huge amount of people are unable to work. So all these parts are individually important, but we must not forget the big picture on how all these parts need to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay? And with that, thank you, and I conclude my presentation.